take it away.
Okay, great. Thanks everybody for joining us this morning. My name is Amy Haase. I'm with RDG Planning and Design, and I am an urban planner. I've been with RDG now for about 23 years, just over 23 years, and I focus most of my work on community comprehensive planning, housing, strategic housing strategies, housing studies, which is what we'll be talking a little bit about today. And then neighborhood and downtown revitalization is where I do the majority of my work over the years, and specifically doing a lot of work around housing and housing strategies. And I've had the opportunity to work with hundreds of cities across the country. And one of the things this session grew out of was last year we completed the statewide housing study for the state of Kansas. And there was a lot of things that I'd always kind of said to communities and tried to express, but it was especially around that we do have some commonalities on our issues between our rural and urban areas, and that really we should all be working together on how we're thinking about strategies at both kind of a regional and statewide level. We've done a lot of multi-county regional studies too, and so it was always interesting to see how, if we think collaboratively, how we can bring more dollars sometimes to our region, we can address things in a kind of a more cooperative way. So I'm gonna spend a little bit of time. Hopefully everybody likes data, because I know I'm a data junkie, and I just assume most planners are a little bit of data junkies. So we're gonna spend the first half of this presentation talking a little bit about the housing trends and what we're seeing happening in the market. And I'm sure there's lots of things that you guys can share too with kind of what you're seeing personally in your own communities, and kind of your own personal experience with housing. I mean, this is one area of planning where I feel like we've all probably had our own personal experiences and personal stories that we can share. We can share from our family members. Talk about some of the common themes then coming out of that, and just share a few kind of case studies, things we've seen that thought all of you might think were kind of interesting. The first part, the data part, is a little bit longer, so I will try to pause after that. I don't know if I'll always be able to see some of the things coming up in the chat box, but do please put any questions you have into that chat box as we're going through, and I will probably pause at the end of that section and just check to see if there is any questions and answer those at that time. I always kind of try to wait as long as I can to go to my share screen mode, because I always feel like you're seeing kind of a slide with this disembodied voice talking in the background. So here's our cover slide. As I mentioned, I guess I'll hit on the objectives that we had outlined for this presentation, just an understanding of current and historic economic trends that are influencing our housing, similarities and differences that we have between our rural and urban economies with regards to housing, and then some potential solutions that we can look at. I'm going to highlight specifically some of the things that we noted for the statewide study for the state of Kansas, but then also pull in some other examples from other states that we've worked with and seen. Okay, so I'm going to dive right in here and start talking a little bit about the economics of housing. One thing that we always emphasize, especially when we're talking about kind of taking a county-wide approach or a regional approach, but really even at a local community level, and that is housing is economic development. And I'm probably preaching to the choir here when I say that, that there's no economic development without places for people to live. For many years, I worked with an economic development director who would always say, I have more jobs than people, and I don't have a place to put them if I can fill those jobs. So his focus often was, I don't need to bring more jobs and businesses. I just need to help my businesses that I have here fill the positions they have and have the housing that those employees need in their community. And it's also interesting. So last year in 2021, the National Association of Realtors estimated that to fill that deficiency that we have in housing, would have a significant economic impact on our communities that would probably be comparable to or even greater than many types of infrastructure spending we do today. So millions of jobs, billions of dollars that would be injected into our economy, and probably they estimated somewhere around $53 billion in new and annual revenue, tax revenues. On the economic side, we often break it down into kind of three parts when we're thinking about housing. We have our macroeconomic. These are the things that probably we have the least impact, or can have probably the least impact on. Interest rates. Maybe I should back up and say, unless you're good friends with the Federal Reserve, or if global forces, what's happening around the world today with regards to our impacts on fuel prices and so forth. Then we have our regional markets, and these are things such as supply of contractors and population growth and the jobs we have, the wages we have. We might have a little bit more influence on that, especially if we're talking about doing more of a kind of a regional approach to thinking about our housing needs. Then we get down to the local things and the things that affect the economics of housing on kind of the local level that we do have a lot more maybe influence on, and that could include things like our zoning regulations, amenities that we have within our communities, including our educational services and so forth. So housing supply and demand, when we think about this, we begin to think about the broader factors that affect nearly all communities. So we're going to spend a little bit of time here talking about these things, the things that affect our broader communities, the things that affect our rural and urban areas a little bit differently, and then how we have some changing influences on the housing market. So one of the things we saw coming out of the 2020 census was this continued kind of shift from continued pattern of shifting populations from our urban areas from our rural areas to our urban areas. Nothing that's surprising to all of you there. You can see it here in that kind of population growth is converging more in our urban centers and their nearby counties. Which is another important part, especially I think for all of you here in Colorado, and you guys are probably aware of this and even more in tune to this than even I am. When we start thinking about our population and delving a little bit deeper about what this looks like, it's really interesting as we see that over 65 population continuing to grow. We're living longer. Our baby boomers are moving or have moved into these age categories or are moving into these age categories. And this is really important when we start thinking about housing and the housing that we need. I think what's also really interesting that I was kind of noting this morning is if you look at that bottom line, the less than 25 years, it's starting to have a little bit of a bend down in 2020. My son turns 20 this week. He's a generation Z, and they are a smaller generation. And so we're gonna start to maybe see a little bit of that impact. Do they continue to live at home longer, like their previous generation did, the millennials, staying maybe living at home a little bit longer and deferring, kind of forming their own household. So all of those things are going to be really interesting. I will also point out, because I've done a lot of work over the years with university communities, I think they're also in a unique situation with just kind of this natural demographic shift that we're seeing, that group that's moving into their college years is a smaller cohort. And so what impact's that going to start to have on those communities' housing market as our colleges and universities are trying to keep students on campus and keep them and fill their dorm rooms? Their landlords, they want to fill their dorm rooms. What impact will that also have on the kind of local housing market too? On the housing occupancy side, we have annual home ownership rates have been ticking up since about 2015 or so across the country and in most regions. This is also a really interesting thing that we saw coming. It was really easy, I think, for us to say coming out of the recession, well, financing changed, people dropped off dramatically in or deferred home ownership. I think that was absolutely a little bit true, but we also saw a lot of millennials entering the housing market. I mean, the leading edge of the millennials were in their mid-20s or so when the recession in 2008 hit. And so, we all start out as renters. So that was also beginning to affect that proportion of households. They were then starting to move into their family formation years, as we refer to it. And so you start to see that uptick in home ownership. Our vacancy rates too have been dropping dramatically. So and what I think is really interesting here is, especially in our single unit structures, basically our single family homes that are being picked up as rental units, is dropping dramatically. I know this is a hot topic in many communities we're working with, from Omaha to the Kansas City metro area, the concerns they're having over national investors coming in and picking up single family homes as rental properties. I've also done some work in the Atlanta metro area, DeKalb County, and they're also very concerned about this. It was really interesting too, because I had one realtor in the Kansas City metro area make the comment to me that they were also very concerned about what happens when these big national investors decide the market has changed and decide to maybe dump all these units on a community potentially at one time. So there's a lot of different things out there that, as we look out into the future, to be thinking about and how we're going to strategize. Another piece that's really important on our housing characteristics, and this really came to light as we were working across on the statewide study in Kansas, and we've also done some statewide work in Iowa, and this was true there too, and that is the age of our housing. We have, especially in our rural areas, a pretty old housing stock. Not to mention, in our rural areas, we had a time period during the 1980s and into the early 1990s where we just weren't building much for housing. So a lot of these communities are struggling with the fact that they're looking for a certain price point home, but that home doesn't exist because it was actually never built. Those homes, in a rural area, that might be in the, $150,000 to $200,000 range, just depending, or maybe a little bit higher. But those are our existing homes, and that we can't build at today, but they don't exist because they weren't built in some of our rural areas. So that aging housing stock also leads to much lower valuations. So you can see our counties that had those older housing stocks also have some very low home values that are below what new construction costs are. So we end up with this gap between the appraised value of our existing housing stock, because it's older, and the cost of new construction that you have. This is one thing where we do often see a commonality between our urban and rural areas. So I have often said that our inner city neighborhoods often have characteristics like our rural areas. One of them being they have an older housing stock, a much older housing stock, which also means they have lower valuations. In this particular one, where I went and grabbed some numbers here from Denver County, the valuations aren't as quite as, that lowest end is still, to a lot of people, would still say, hey, that's pretty high. At $194,000, we can't build a new home at that price point, but we probably have some appraisals values in the area that can help us with that. But it is still true that reinvestment, the older housing stock, needing to continue to have housing rehab programs and stabilizing the older units is a very common theme between our urban and rural areas, urban inner city areas. The median home, looking at our home pricing and what's been happening over the last couple decades, well, this is even more. It goes back to back almost 5 decades. So again, we've seen steady increases in those values since about 2012, coming out of the recession when it started to pick back up as you I'm sure are all aware, you fall into the West region, and that has seen a much more dramatic upswing in that time period compared to other parts of the country. So that was this slide here was looking at our existing home prices. This one's looking at new home prices. Again, significant continued upticks in the cost of new construction and new home prices. I think this was a really interesting point. Hopefully the text isn't too small here, but the producer price index for construction materials rose over 50 points since the beginning of 2012. And it had previously, it took about 11 years for that same type of increase. So in a little bit here, we're also going to talk about real family income and how that kind of ties in then too with our actual construction costs. But ultimately, it all begins to think about what are we producing and what are we building. So on the private side, we've been looking at construction rates, private housing units within those areas, and we have started to see an uptick again. It's really interesting here, I think, how the South has potentially responded with even more aggressive kind of construction rates than other parts of the country. We also have the types of units that we're producing. And I think, again, this is pretty interesting when we're thinking about the overall market. The private housing units that we're seeing constructed are often, the darkest line here are 1-unit constructions. And then the orange line is our structures with 5 units or more. This is interesting. We're just finishing up a housing affordability action plan for the city of Omaha. And this almost exactly mirrors their construction activity, at least within the last probably 10 years. They've even had a couple of years where the number of units being produced in 5+ structures was actually even greater than their 1 unit, than their single family homes. But when we start thinking about the 3 and 4 unit structures and the duplexes, which you can't even read here because it's actually covered up by the 3 and 4 units, we're building very few of those. But yet we have a growing number of households, our 65+ households, 55+ households, who are probably looking for units that are lower maintenance options, things that allow you to live in maybe a sense of community a little bit more. And we're not producing those units. Traditionally, we've also always said that those are the units that we can maybe sometimes start to, these are a missing middle housing too, just as many of you are probably aware. But the demographics are saying that we have the opportunity for these units. The construction costs would also say that the potential to build these units is there when we can hopefully get some economy of scale. Now, I will say in recent conversations, and I've tested this, we've heard this question or this fact being shared everywhere from Wisconsin to Oklahoma last week, and that is the supply chain issue is impacting a little bit on that economy of scale. Right now, what they're finding is to buy bathroom fixtures for a single family unit is they're not getting any cost break by saying, I'm going to go do a 4-plex or I'm going to do a series of duplexes and I'm going to order multiple bathroom fixtures as opposed to the single bathroom fixture. They're not seeing that price discount right now because of the supply chain issues that they're experiencing. So there is a little bit of that anomaly going on in the market right now. However, land prices in most markets that we're working in are not decreasing. So how are we using that land in the most efficient way possible? And I think that is one of the things that's driving an interest in density that I've seen in our rural communities and even in our kind of Midwestern areas where they've traditionally, gobble up as much land as you want. Nobody's going to worry about it. That is starting to impact how they're thinking. I will also say kind of as a little bit of a side note on the demographic side here and what we're producing construction wise, A few weeks ago, I had the chance to interview Dan Perolik for a podcast called Booked on Planning. And one of the questions that I asked him, so he's the author of Missing Middle Housing. And one of the questions I asked him was there anything that kind of surprised him about who's moving into the units that are, especially the new projects he's been involved with that are focused on the production of missing middle housing. And he said there's a lot of single women households. That one actually, I was expecting him to say, well, you know, we're seeing a lot of, you know, kind of young professionals and retiree or, you know, 50 empty nesters who want something lower maintenance, want that sense of community. But I thought that was really interesting that they're actually seeing a lot of also single women households that are interested in those product types. So just a little bit of a side note there on construction and what we're seeing. On the sales side, construction wise, we are also we're also seeing a decline in the number of active listings. It dropped dramatically starting in about March of 2020 and then picked up a little bit. I would note that many of the markets we were working in that although the number of listings went down, as I'm sure you're not surprised, the actual number of sales wasn't really changing that much year over from 2019 for many communities. But what was happening is their sales, as I'm sure you all heard the stories, were happening fast. Something got on the market, it sold immediately, and lots of buyers were just sitting there looking with the historic interest rates that they were trying to jump on those opportunities. So that's a really interesting piece that's happening in the market. The other thing that I think is really interesting, and we'll talk about this maybe a little bit more in the interest rate piece, is, you know, any slowdown that I had a realtor mention to me that potentially any slowdown that we're seeing right now in the housing market might be pretty short as compared to our, you know, 2008, 2009 timeframe, because we don't have the supply of housing that we had at that time. We had a pretty good inventory for those realtors to, as he described it, kind of burn through. That inventory, as we're going to see here in a little bit, doesn't exist as much. So it'll be really interesting to see the impact that that's going to be having on how long this slowdown does last. But I do think there's some other factors to take into consideration there. Again, as we mentioned, the private construction that's happening, this correlates back to where we're seeing much of our growth. We're seeing that happening inside our MSAs and not as much in our rural areas. We'll talk a little bit about this a little bit more as it relates to some of the construction activity here. But one of the things that's definitely impacting our construction activity is our labor market. When we were working on the statewide housing study, we came back to kind of our, we had a committee we were working with representation from across the entire state. We said over and over again, we were hearing from communities, it didn't matter if it was Kansas City, Topeka, Wichita, or the most rural areas of Kansas, we were hearing one of our biggest problems is we just don't have enough people to actually help us build houses. We don't have enough in labor to swing a hammer or install a toilet, is how I often described it. So we said, we actually think that one of the issues that we need to hit on in your housing study is your labor shortage and and the need for workforce development, specifically around the building trades. So, you know, it's really the other piece of this, I think, too, is when we think about it, we often talk about on our unemployment rate, and we have these historically low unemployment rates. And I actually think the labor participation rate is a more interesting number to look at, because you can look at the unemployment rate and you can say, okay, those are people that are actively listening, but how many people are actually just not even looking anymore, have chosen to stay home, have chosen to stay on the sidelines? I went and Googled last night. Colorado has almost a 70%, you're like 69.8 on your labor participation rate. That's pretty high. It's higher than the national average that I have kind of outlined here. So we don't have a lot of people that are choosing to sit out. But we also do, I think the other important thing to keep in mind is that even if we hadn't seen the pandemic in 2020, we were naturally going to see fewer and fewer people in the labor market because our baby boomers were moving into their retirement years. I had a lady one time at a meeting make a comment, and this was in probably 2021, and she said she had worked for the Department of Labor. This was in the state of Nebraska. Worked for the Department of Labor in the late 1980s. And at that time, they were predicting that they could potentially have a labor shortage in 2020. And that was just based on kind of demographics of what was happening. At the same time, we're also seeing, we talk about the increasing costs in homes, and but at the same time, we're also seeing real incomes that were finally, before the pandemic, coming out of the recession, beginning to see a little bit of an uptick. And since about 2019, really actually even before COVID, we started to see this drop in real incomes. And I think a lot of people have clearly seen that in the last 12 months, and the inflation that we've been seeing. The chart there up at the top is median home price increasing by 29%. And this is inflation adjusted since 1999, where median household income has only increased by 10% over that same time period. So I'm going to pause here. Feel like I've went through a lot of data and just things that we see as driving the overall market. And I'm going to see if we have any questions in the chat box.
Hi, Amy. I do not see any questions in the Whova app or on Zoom.
Okay, sounds great. I will keep moving ahead then. So some of the common themes that we're seeing. Touched on this a little bit, undervaluation. So there's two things that often happen in a market. We can have an undervaluation and we can have an overvaluation. And neither one of them are a good thing for a market. They have serious impacts on our construction activity specifically. So when we have a depressed housing values, that makes new construction very difficult. And that is something we have definitely seen in some of our older rural areas, in some of our inner city neighborhoods, when those appraisals don't meet the cost of construction. Sometimes that construction just doesn't even happen. And I will say it's not just on new construction, but it can also be something that is impacting the ability to reinvest in existing homes. So if you have a home that you have to, that needs $80,000 worth of work, but once you put that $80,000 in, you're maybe only going to turn around and sell it. You're going to break even, or just not make enough profit on it. You're going to end up with households that are choosing not to reinvest in their property, or you don't have those flippers that want to come in and that are actually can be good for our markets at times. On the other end of it, though, we definitely have markets where we have the opposite happening, where we have this overvaluation and we're seeing people who've come in and done some of those flips and made the house unaffordable within those markets or those communities. And we're getting more and more organizations that are talking about strategies to address that issue too. It was really interesting here in Omaha. We have a very active Habitat for Humanity, and they have set aside some funds to specifically go in and purchase homes that have been rental homes. They're trying to, or purchase homes that could be potentially picked up by investors, and kind of proactively doing that to protect those as affordable single family homes in some of our targeted neighborhoods and some of our older inner city neighborhoods. So that it's an interesting strategy that I think is starting to gain some conversations about how we address those issues. One of the other things that's really interesting, and hopefully this isn't too hard to read here, and this pattern, I grabbed this from the state of Kansas, so it shows the different regions, but this is a pattern, and I'll show it on the next slide here, between an urban and a rural area that we see in a lot of communities. What this is basically telling us is that we have a lot of units that are affordable to households making between $25,000 and $75,000. But we have a real shortage of units for households making over $75,000 a year in a lot of our markets. Those households then end up competing for these same units. I always joke that, just because just because we have a shortage of housing for households making $100,000 a year does not mean those households are living in their car. They're filling up units that would be affordable to households making less. Oh, so does that mean, and I would point out, if it's kind of hard to read on your screen here, that this first one, that's the KC metro area, Sedgwick County is Wichita, and Shawnee Douglas is Topeka, Lawrence in the Kansas area. And then the rest of the areas are pretty rural in nature. And so you see this pattern playing out in our rural and our urban areas. Let's see, there was something else I was going to add. Oh, so I think the important thing to keep in mind here is that just because a household can afford more doesn't mean they're going to move. So the one over, this is kind of showing that same graph, but for a couple in a little bit different way and for two specific communities. On the left is Ottumwa, Iowa. I guess I should have added that to the end. If you don't know, and if you're not a big MASH fan and know that's where Raid R. O'Reilly was from, was Ottumwa, Iowa. And then Omaha, the more urban in comparison. And the same thing where our highest income households have this gap in units that are available to them. However, as I was starting to say, that does not mean our solution is let's just build a bunch more of $400,000, $500,000 homes, that we're just going to have all these households move. That is not the case. Many of these households, one, are living in homes that, that's where they love their neighborhood. They have a personal finance philosophy that says, I don't want to spend that much on my housing. I'm just going to stay where I'm at. I think the other piece of it that, and this was a quote, I literally heard at a meeting, why would I want to move for granite countertops and another garage? I'll just stay where I'm at. I'm happy with the home I'm in and the neighborhood I'm in. But I would move for a different unit, a lower maintenance unit, a quality of life sorts of things. So it's not, the solution here isn't just saying, let's build more high-priced single-family detached homes, but really starts to say, we need more variety in the market. These households aren't pushing the market to build more single-family homes. They're staying in their homes because they're not seeing the product that they desire in the market today. Another trend we're seeing is very low vacancy rates. So historically low vacancy rates. This graph specifically looks nationally at, and this is from the Federal Reserve, the rental vacancy rates for Colorado being below 5%. That matches up with we did a rental survey with landlords in Omaha and found that they were running at about a 4% vacancy rate. The thing to keep in mind, the couple things, I fully appreciate, I've had landlords tell me this, I don't have any vacant units, therefore we don't have a housing issue. We do, because when individuals, as we all know as planners, when individuals move to a community, we need options for them, or when a household, when someone decides I don't need a roommate anymore, I can afford to have my place on my own, that they have that unit to choose from. But the other thing is that within the pro forma, when a developer is putting a pro forma together for a new multifamily project, they're assuming probably at least a 7% vacancy rate. And when we asked in the survey the reasoning why, or if they had raised their rental rates, and then in the last year to 18 months, and if so, why, the two biggest responses we got were just property tax increases in property taxes. And I will note, increases in property taxes were not due to actual city or school districts or anybody increasing property taxes. It was due to increasing valuations on their properties, increasing their property taxes. And then the other was just increasing in overall expenses from maintenance to personnel that they had to hire. But there were a few who said, hey, market's tight. It's an opportunity to raise my rent. I haven't raised my rent in a few years, and I saw this as the opportunity to begin to raise my rent. So there was acknowledgement that we were also raising it because the demand was there, supply demand economics, right? Creating some of that rental increases, especially in our older existing units. On the vacancy rates too, we are also seeing a very interesting phenomenon. Now, this is just across the board, owner, renter, occupied overall. That last slide was just looking at rental vacancy rates. But one of the things we're also seeing in many states is really high vacancy rates in our rural areas. And what they're telling us is there's no way, when we have somebody who's we have a new teacher, we have a new, we're trying to recruit a doctor to our rural hospital. They can't find anything to live in. And so there's no way we're running at a 20 or a 29 or even a 15% vacancy rate. When we delve a little bit deeper, what we're seeing is the census is categorizing a large number of vacant units as other vacant, which means they're dilapidated and not occupiable. Somebody's just holding on to them. Mom went to the nursing home, or mom passed away and the family doesn't know what to do with the unit and it's sitting there vacant. So though they're getting categorized under that in that bucket. So I think there's a lot in our rural areas where we need to take a step back and say, is that accurate? Do you actually have those units, but they're just not on the market? And if so, what do we need to do to get them on the market? And this, that's also really important. I will say, I also have a full appreciation because I've worked in markets like Branson and Lake of the Ozarks and some other areas where we have a lot of visitor population. You're going to see very high vacancy rates in those areas because seasonally occupied units are considered vacant. So that's going to create a much higher vacancy rate. And then you layer into that our short-term rentals now impacting those lower vacancies that we have. So in those markets, those vacancy rates are probably pretty accurate. Interest rates and things we are seeing happening excuse me, in the interest rate side. Existing homeowners, I think it's going to have a really interesting impact on, if you refinanced, or about what I hope if you were running at about a much higher interest rate than in the last 12 to 18 months that you refinanced, there's a good chance you're going to stay in your existing home. Why would I move? I'm not going to move for granite countertops and an extra garage and switch from a 3% vacancy rate to what could potentially be an 8% interest rate. I'm going to stay in my home at the 3% and not move and go into that 8%. I'm going to move because I really do need a unit that fits my stage of life better. My family's gotten much bigger and we're just running out of room. This house is too big. I don't want to take care of the yard anymore. Those are the things that are going to probably motivate some of or I'm moving for a job, or I'm moving for others, maybe a quality of life reason that you're moving. But otherwise, I think we're going to see some homeowners in the next year or so that are going to stay in place without some serious motivation to move, which is only going to continue to create that issue with our shortage of units that are on the market today. I also, in the last week or so, heard a lot of concerns from our bankers about homes currently under construction. So what they're concerned about, and this will probably be a little bit more of a shorter term issue, is that they saw builders, individual and individuals who were building their, dream home. They were financing their construction loan at a 3%. And now they're at the point where they need to convert that construction loan into a permanent mortgage, and they're seeing dramatically higher interest rates. Now, the bankers have told me that yes, they knew that interest rates were going to go up, and they planned that when they were working with these individuals, but not as much as they've actually seen. So there is some concern in some locations that you're going to see individuals who are saying, I can't make that work at that big of an interest rate, because you could potentially be talking about, hundreds of thousands of dollars difference in their monthly mortgage payment. And so there's definitely some concerns that could happen kind of short term within that market that could really impact the units under construction today. The rental market continues to be very tight. If there isn't ownership options on the market, people will continue to stay in the rental units longer. That's something we've definitely seen. The landlords across the board have told me they're seeing more and more that, less turnover in their units. And then just overall pent up demand, something that I'm sure all of you are aware of, related to the underproduction. It's widespread across the entire country. That, in Colorado, it's especially high in your underproduction. You're kind of on the higher end of that spectrum. It's interesting to note there are 3 states that this analysis considered to be meeting production levels, and your neighbor to the north is one of them. And your neighbors to the east have underproduction, but not at the same level. And I'll be completely honest, Western Kansas and Western Nebraska, we definitely were hearing people saying they were selling in Colorado and buying cheaper in Kansas and in Western Nebraska, in those 2 Western locations. I would say it was probably more individuals that were in that 55 plus category, but it was an interesting thing that we were hearing from different conversations we've been having. So again, a lot of what we've talked about ties back into making sure that we have housing at every stage of life, from growing up and starting your household. We all start out as renters, so renters aren't evil people. And being able to move through that market to making lifestyle choices of where you need. I do joke that my husband and I are we are not in the favor of most realtors. We moved into that starting home and we haven't left in 20 some years. We've stayed in that, and probably we will skip that middle and we will go to something that's more of a lifestyle choice as we move into our retirement and empty nest years. I will pause again just for a second to see if there's any questions, and then I'm going to try to go through some strategies a little bit and talk about those. Any questions?
I don't see any questions for this section too. We have a quiet bunch out there.
They are quiet. Okay, so what are some of the strategies? I want to talk a little bit about some of the things that we identified in the statewide study, and then I'm going to also talk a little bit about some very specific kind of case studies. I'm going to take a drink here for just a second. Okay, on the middle income housing. So our strategies in this study all laid out around some kind of core goals that were identified, and beginning with increasing the number of units available to middle income households. We identified, and I'm just going to share some of the local strategies. I'm not going to share the statewide strategies that were identified. If you're interested in those, you can go to the Kansas Housing Resources, KHRC's website. The study is all there. It's even in a story map format if you want to look at it in that format. But I'm just gonna hit on some of the local programs or initiatives that we discussed, because I will say this was one thing at the state level that the state did a significant injection of funds this year. They have a middle income housing program that they were funding at about $2 million a year, which actually kind of made me chuckle, because I was like, $2 million don't go very far anymore. But they injected about $20 million into that program this year, and hopefully that can start to be maintained. Some of the funding that was injected was COVID related, but some of it was not. So hopefully that can continue. But at a local level, we're seeing communities doing bond programs. And I've seen this everywhere from a community, Newton, Iowa, which is about 12,000 in population, that did a housing bond, voter approved housing bond to help with subdivision development, to help with first time home buyer programs, to really begin to inject back into the market their housing activities. So they were the home of Maytag. Maytag left and their housing market came to a complete halt. So they needed to kind of restart that, and they used that all the way up to Greensboro, North Carolina, where they also have a housing bond program. So we've seen that in the full spectrum of communities. Kansas also has, so listed on here is a program that's called it's RHID, Rural Housing Incentive Districts. It's basically TIF is the best way to describe it, but it's used to do subdivision development, and then they had extended that to upper story. So trying to incentivize conversion of upper stories. They also will use industrial revenue bonds, which is another Kansas program, to help fund some of that. They also saw this need for continued need for low-income housing. One of the things that they were struggling with is they're seeing thousands of units potentially leaving the LIHTC program that they had early on in the program. They had opted to be able to have the option to opt out at 15 years. Kansas has since limited that, so hopefully they won't be having this problem, but they're seeing thousands of units leaving right now. So talking a little bit about the gap financing to secure some of those, but also potentially gap financing that's needed to help get new LIHTC projects actually done. And this gets into different bond rating sorts of issues. Encouraging or incentivizing landlords to accept Section 8 vouchers. This is something we hear across many markets of, individuals can, they get in a long wait to get a voucher, they finally get the voucher, but then they can't find a unit that will accept it, which is a challenging one, especially when we're running at a 4% vacancy rate. It's really easy for the landlord to say, hey, I don't have to fill out any paperwork. I don't have to have my property inspected to qualify. And I've got 5-6 people behind you in line who I don't have to do any of that for, who I can rent this unit to. So what are some things that we can do to incentivize it? It was really interesting in the Kansas City, Kansas area. There was actually some discussion in one of our conversations about, do you actually create kind of an insurance program? Because I think there is a lot of stereotypes around around those individuals who own our vouchers and maybe the things they could potentially do to property. So that was a really interesting conversation. And then just overall coordination of services that are out there and available to households that are struggling. Conservation of our older housing stock. Our best source of affordable housing is the housing that exists within our community today. We'll never be able to build that unit at the same price we built it in 1990 or 1960. So programs like acquisition, rehab, resale, I've seen these be very successful. And we actually have an example that I'm going to use as a case study in here, but from very rural areas in a community of 5,000 people to more urban areas. But the thing that I always emphasize with these programs is these are not our homes that need $100,000 worth of work. These are the homes that we just need to continue to make sure they remain good quality, stable units and remain as owner occupied too, hopefully. Local rehab programs. One of the things that we encourage a lot of communities is, can you figure out a way to locally fund or leverage local dollars to fund rehab programs? Because when you start to get into state and federal dollars, especially CBDG and other funds, they come with a lot of paperwork. They take a lot of man hour to manage those programs. So if I always say, if you can figure out a way to leverage local dollars, you make the rules, you identify what your community needs the most. And we'll have another example of that here in one of the case studies. Vacancy rate assessments. So we talked about the fact that in our rural communities, they really needed to get an understanding of, were those vacancy rates correct? If so, how do we get some of those units on the market? or do we just need to be, demoing properties? What needs to be addressed to really get our hands around that vacancy rate? Diversity of housing. We need more housing, but we don't need more of what we've been producing for the last probably 50 years. We need to be encouraging projects that bring products to the market that really encourage people to move, that they look at that and say, that's a reason why I would move and leave my home and create some churn within the market. This can be done through development agreements that communities can do. We can do this through streamlining the process. If you're building, and we're going to have an example of that here in a case study. If you're building a certain product type or following this template, you get a streamlined approval process. This ties also into package site plans. So, time is money to these developers, and the more time it takes them to do a project, the more they put those expenses back into the unit, which goes to the home buyer or to the renter that they're paying. I think the other piece of it too is that on the time is money, we have definitely seen NIMBY impacting that. So we saw in Johnson County, Kansas, which is the very high income area, suburb area of the Kansas City metro area. We definitely heard, developers say, we're not even going to try to do that product type or to do a LIHTC project because we know the NIMBY would be so challenging to work through. It's not worth it. We can't make the numbers. We literally, it's as much about a numbers thing because of the cost and the time process. We also need to be thinking about building more human capital. So training and development of individuals who understand the housing programs that we have out there, but that also ties into our building trades and labor shortages. Thinking about, are we having sponsorship programs? In rural areas, especially, we sponsor doctors to come back to our rural areas. Maybe we need to be thinking about that for our plumbers and electricians. Succession planning. A lot of those skilled trade individuals are in their retirement years and still working or really close to their retirement years. And what will happen to their business and how are we helping them do that? So I'm kind of moving a little bit quicker here because I know we're down to the last few minutes, but some example case studies, and some of these you might be familiar with. This one, the South Bend one, I think was just recently featured maybe in APA Planning Magazine, but pre-approved housing. So in South Bend, Indiana, they basically created a package of homes that say these match within our neighborhoods, they're appropriate in our neighborhoods, they will fit within the lots that we have in our neighborhoods. They kind of described it as, here's our Sears catalog that are contextually appropriate for what we're doing. And they basically are just allowed by right, and it's an easy process to move through as long as it kind of meets that base zoning district. We talk a lot about the need to create partnerships that traditionally, until the last few years, we have not seen a lot of state and federal dollars being injected into housing programs. Now that's changed. I know Nebraska, Iowa, Kansas has taken a lot of their ARPA funds and injected it into housing. Oklahoma has not. So it does vary from state to state. But that's going to be for a short window, which I also think is kind of interesting as a little side note, as we think about our labor pieces. I'm curious. In Omaha, they've received millions of dollars to use from ARPA funds to use towards affordable housing. And I was like, part of me is like, that's great, but who's going to actually build the houses? Like, we don't have enough workers to actually build the houses. But anyway, that's my little side note. But here in Omaha, we have a very robust philanthropic community, and they have turned their eye to the housing issue, which is great. There's a group called Front Porch Investments, and they are within our community foundation is how they originally started. I will, in full disclosure, admit they were heavily funded by the Sherwood Foundation, which might have a Buffett in the name of it, but they've created a partnership with the city of Omaha, and the city is dedicating $20 million in ARPA funding, which Front Porch is matching, with focuses on things like gap financing and just creating more housing that's close to our jobs and our transit centers, creating, how we're helping support people in staying in affordable housing. And so it'll be really interesting to see kind of the impact that starts to have. Those are the types of things you don't really know the full impact probably for a few years. Faribault, Minnesota. Yes, that is pronounced Faribault. They have a program that's a mobile home buyout program. So owners of uninhabitable or dilapidated mobile homes can apply for this program. They get a flat $2,000 and the city hauls off the mobile home. We are also, I should say, there's a lot of programs going back to the mobile home. We'll call them, when they're dilapidated, they're a mobile home. When they're new, they're a manufactured home. But anyway, there's a lot of programs right now that are encouraging manufactured housing. So that's different from our modular construction. But there's Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac have a program that if you take a manufactured home and put it on a permanent foundation, remove it from the chassis, make it so it can never be moved again, it can now be financed as real property. So that's a really interesting things that we're seeing out there. I mentioned the purchase rehab resale. That's the PRR. Columbus, Nebraska, city of about 23,000. They have a program where they have gone in and rehabbed. That number now is probably low at 140 homes. But again, not major, we need to put $100,000 into these. These are homes that they're trying to keep affordable to first-time home buyers. A lot of times, doesn't have to be though, but just a way for them to be able to get into the market. And some of those things like sidings and roofs and driveway replacements and HVAC systems, and those things can be done and taken care of, and the home kept affordable for that household. Norton, Kansas. So this is, now we're going to go into some rural, smaller population, much smaller population. They have a free lot program, not unusual. We see that in a lot of rural communities because absorption rates are so small or so low. Cities usually have to come in and do the lot development and then basically give the lots away. But they also have some programs for incentivizing building on infill lots. So just a package of $10,000 to $12,000 that you can get for building on one of those infill lots. They also have a senior living relocation incentive. So they're giving like a $5,000 incentive to any senior household that chooses to move out of their home into one of their more senior oriented projects or within the community, which is really interesting. It's this awareness that we have homes that are affordable to young families, but we have maybe some of our older adults, older households that are living in those units. And how do we encourage them or incentivize them to free up their home to that young family in the community? Finally, neighborhood revitalization in Excelsior Springs, Missouri. And in this case, the city assembled all of the land. They gave the land as part of a larger scale redevelopment then, and they did an RFP process, had a new affordable owner occupied, and then they also had acquired some older affordable rentals, naturally occurring affordable rentals, that they then also did an RFP to rehab. So it became a mixture of new construction and rehab along a corridor actually adjacent to the downtown. So it's been a very successful process. So those are a few of the case studies. Happy to answer any questions that anybody has. I'm going to stop sharing because I always feel that's better. And I'm right. I was worried about being short.
That was a lot of information and really good information. It was kind of surprising. I was like, especially all the trends in the housing. That was really good. Really good.
It's always borderline. Hopefully, I always figure planners love data though, right?
I love data. I don't know about anybody else, but I love the data because that's what you can hang your hat on as well. Yeah. That's what the report says. Yeah. I don't see any questions, but if anyone has any, you want to type them in real quick, we probably can hang around for a bit longer. If you don't, we do have the ability to contact Amy through the Hooba app if you have questions or you think about them later. The recording will go up towards the end of the day, so you can go back through and pull out some of that data if you want to. But any closing remarks you'd like to have?
No, I was just going to say I'll put my email address at least in the chat there if anybody wants it.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, with no questions, we're going to go ahead and end today. And I want to thank you for presenting, and we'll let everybody go about their way.
Great. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.